ahead and get started in just a few minutes. We're bringing folks over into the panel right now. You should be receiving an invitation soon that'll prompt you to accept and be promoted to the panel. Also, we are in the process of enabling our cart interpretation function as soon as we bring our cart interpreter over as well onto the panel and go ahead and give her those permissions. So if that is a function that you're hoping to utilize today, please go ahead and get that setting enabled on your Zoom.
Okay. Lisa, you should be all set as the captioner.
Thank you.
As folks enter, you should be able to see the presentation on the screen. As always, I have you guys over here on my other screen, and I'm looking at the presentation here. So if you have a question or if you have something in the chat box that I'm just not seeing, please don't hesitate to come off mute or either to ask your question and talk, or to maybe point out that somebody has their hand raised or has a question in the chat box too. And folks on the BDS side and the A&M side will also try to let me know if they see something as well.
Jess, we have a lot of people coming on as guests. Do you want me to bring them over to panelists or leave them as guests?
So typically our panel stays in the actual webinar, but our guests, of course, we want them to observe, but they're able to chat with us through the chat function or the Q&A function.
Just a heads up, it does seem like the chat may be disabled. So I think if we're not able to get that turned back on, people should probably use the Q&A feature
Lisa,
instead.
I'll turn it on.
Okay, great.
Thank you, Peggy Sue. All right, and just a quick thumbs up when our panel members are all over, and we'll go ahead and jump in.
Could you assign me one more time as captioner? I don't have a chat box. I don't have the box didn't come up.
There you are. Oh, hold on, Montreal, you got the wrong, went to Montreal for some reason. Hold on. Try it now, Lisa.
So anyone trying to turn on or enable the captioning, we're just working through that right now to make sure we get those permissions assigned, and you should be able to enable that very soon. All right, do we have our panelists over?
Yes.
Excellent, excellent. And we have several folks observing. I see a couple of panelists in there, so I'm going to go ahead and promote a few. And folks, please feel free to drop something in the chat or to or the Q&A if
Jessica, this is Krista.
Hi, Krista.
It looks
Krista,
like
you're
we're still. I am here. I made it.
Nice.
It looks like we're still having some trouble with the captioning. Oh, here it comes. I was gonna say it was not working for a minute, but now it's on. Thank you.
Got it. Okay, good. Thank you.
Thank you for pausing for that. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. We're just gonna take one more look at the lobby and see if there's any other group members. Okay, any other group members, if you think you're not over and joining the party and you should be, go ahead and let us know and we'll make sure to get you moved over. And for folks joining, as I mentioned at the top of the meeting, go ahead, you can utilize the chat feature, the Q&A feature to reach out, and we will make sure we're watching that chat box, or if anybody's able to give me a hand and give me a quick shout or holler, especially if it's somebody from the audience who's in there who doesn't have the ability to come off mute. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and start. So this month we are going to be talking about provider qualifications for our waiver services. So now we sat down over the last several months, we kind of envisioned what the new waiver might offer for services. And just a quick reminder too, there is a waiver amendment out there right now. I mentioned that in our February meeting. This amendment, though, that's out right now does not include these new services, any new rates, anything like that that's going on. The current waiver that's out there is going over cap information that we're putting in. So for example, in the past, it might have said something like the area agency is responsible for service planning. We had to go in and appropriately reflect that the service coordinator is responsible for service planning. In other places, it might have said the area agency is responsible for service provision and billing. So we had to go in there and update that the provider is doing the service provision and that all providers have the opportunity to bill directly to Medicaid. Those are the types of changes going in. We are going to be posting, so there's a public comment session tomorrow in the evening that we'll be talking about the changes that we did make, so that if people have questions around our corrective action compliance, they can talk to us. And also any minute now, there should be a summary document coming out that kind of captures a lot of that information so that folks have a little bit of info going into that session and an idea of what those changes are. So we'll make sure we get it on the website and email it out to the same distribution group that we emailed the notice of the waiver amendment to earlier this month. Okay. So this month, what we're hoping to talk about are the residential services and those provider qualifications. So my hope really is to give folks a bit of a baseline and not assume that all of us on the call know what the current provider requirements are and the provider qualifications are for provision of residential services. And just really have a conversation around some of the recommendations we've already discussed, and also our workforce subcommittee that gave us the recommendation around credentialing and how that'll be reflected within the waiver service provider qualifications. And if there's anything else that folks have been thinking about, from each of your positions and how you interact with our service system, anything else that you've ever thought, gee, wouldn't it be nice if, or gee, that just seems a little too stringent for this particular type of service, and try to gather all that information so that we can produce some provider qualifications. So we're trying to, for the purpose of this conversation, it's hard to categorize the services, but as we move through them, we're kind of looking at them starting with the community resident services, so staffed residence type services. Shared living kind of, is on the border in some perspectives, and in some regards, we look at it similarly, a provider owned and operated type setting. But in other instances, and appropriately so, we consider it a bit more aligned with living in your own home or your family's home or a family home setting. So, we'll keeping in mind that one, sometimes some of the things that we all might think are appropriate for a staffed residence type requirement might look a little bit different in shared living, shared family living, or enhanced family care, as it's currently called. And then we'll look at some of the services, talk about them where somebody is living independent or with their family. And then some of the in-home personal care, provision of personal care in someone's own home, almost a standalone conversation there. What would the requirements be for someone who is providing that service? Stabilization services. So these work very similar to our current crisis services. what, if anything, would be different? Would it be aligned with the type of service that's provided, especially where we think of crisis services a lot of time with regard to increased supervision and support, direct service support. And then, a quick preview of some neighboring states and some, ideas, food for thought for us around what some neighboring states have done with their stabilization services. And then what we won't be talking about are some of those more, I guess I'll call them invoice services, something that would likely not be a provider requirement or qualification that we would lay out. Your transitional assistance services, for example, if somebody's moving to a less restrictive setting, we won't necessarily be making direct requirements other than, having the appropriate credentials in the area that you are in the service that you're providing. So if you're paying to have cable connected, paying to have electricity set up, that would follow that appropriately qualified business entity. And same too with chore services. So we're going to be focusing more on the direct services today. Any question? Oh, we got a couple chats.
But we're all set with the chats.
Oh, excellent. Yep. Couple of folks saying good morning and that folks are on the line. All right. So here we go. So currently, provider qualifications. There are various qualifications found in different rules right now, especially when it's specific to, the rule is specific to a particular service, think employment. For today's discussion, focus more on residential services. We have a couple of rules that we would want to, that we've kind of tried to bullet out here. Of course, this is not exhaustive, but some of the requirements that you'll find both within our HEM 506 that goes over provider qualifications for any agency providing developmental services, and then our HEM 1001 that goes over certification for community residences. Our licensing requirements are found in state statute, so we've not re-articulated them here, but really looking at 506 and 1001 to understand from this group and just start having a conversation around whether we think these requirements make sense. Are they sufficient? Should they be more stringent? Should they be less stringent? Do we think that they would all be appropriate for all of those services that we looked at? As I mentioned before, are there others that should follow some of these and maybe should not follow some of these? So 506 right now requires that it refers to applicants, so applicants for that position to provide those services, that they meet any minimum standards in the job description. So any job description that's put out for that provider to respond to requires a tuberculosis test prior to employment. There's a requirement in there, so too in 1001, that the staff be at least 18 years old. And then there's a requirement that the provider agency obtain references and complete criminal record checks. So our a crim check, BEAS, I believe DCYF registry check is included in that. Correct me if I'm wrong, folks, too, from your perspectives as well. And then it prohibits employment by people with felony convictions or some misdemeanors. Although 506 does outline the process as well if a individual was comfortable and wanted to request a waiver to that particular rule to be considered. So 1001 points of difference would be the requirement of an orientation around rights and communication. And that we'll say, for lack of a better word, new or inexperienced staff perhaps must have direct oversight and support within their first 16 hours. And then within their first 6 months, staff must be trained on everyday health and elements that contribute to an individual's quality of life, skill building strategies, positive behavioral support, and individual choice. So with all of that said, does anybody want to dive into any of these bullet points a little bit more to talk about them or figure out if they're good, not, or if there's room for, if there's opportunity for enhancements around some of these areas?
Jess, this is Krista.
Hi, Krista.
Just for clarification purposes, are we, so we're currently discussing the existing provider qualifications, and then we're going to discuss the recommended provider qualifications by the DSP subcommittee. Is that what's happening?
So kind of, yeah. I think right now, I think in my scan of the residential services, what we're proposing and what there currently is. And I don't want to influence the group with my opinion, but if I were kind of offering my observation, it would be that 506 and 1001 has some fairly well-developed requirements. They're at this point tried and true. Our providers are familiar with them. I think we want to make sure that as a system, we're ensuring that individuals and families are familiar with them too, but that is not so much questioning the standards as, hey, communication's always best, and let's think of best practices and how we make sure folks are informed. With that said, we would want to also include the credentialing requirement from our workforce subcommittee and include that in the in the provider qualifications that we create. But what above and beyond, or do folks have a different opinion and think, hey, 506, 1001, too strict? We think some of this should be a little bit, you know, less prescriptive.
Okay, so I'm just trying to pull up what the recommendations were from that group, because I know a lot of time was spent on that group.
Absolutely.
So it wasn't just a credentialing requirement. So I'm on my phone feverishly trying to pull up those recommendations, because I know they spent a lot of time on provider qualifications. So I'm taking some time to do that, trying to pull it up on my phone. But also, I'm not sure what some misdemeanors are. So if you could provide some information about that while I try to pull up those recommendations, other than the credentialing, that would be great. Thank you.
Okay. Let me pull up 506 quickly.
Jess, I also have it up if you'd like me to read it off.
Yeah, please. Thank you.
So, Krista, the rule reads that the provider agency shall not hire a person who has any misdemeanor that involves physical or sexual assault, violence, exploitation, child pornography, threatening or reckless conduct, theft, driving under the influence of drugs or alcohol, or any other conduct that represents evidence of a behavior that could hurt an individual, essentially. So those are the things that are specifically called out within the misdemeanor category that would lead to a prohibition on employment.
Thank you.
And folks, now that we've read that off too, if there's anybody that wants it flashed on the screen, if, you know, evaluating and writing is helpful, I can share it while we have some conversation too. So
Yeah, if you could pull it up, I think that might be helpful for those of us that process more visually.
Absolutely.
And the reason I'm asking is because I know that there has been more discussion, at least in some of the meetings that I've been in terms of just equity and, you know, certainly wanting to ensure safety for individuals receiving services, but in terms of equity for people that are, you know, trying to rehabilitate themselves, and equity in terms of employment. So, you know, I'm just wondering if we can just pause for a moment and look at some of these, and just kind of have a discussion about it. Certainly, you know, I'm not an expert on this, but just wanting to kind of consider a discussion about that. Thank you.
You're welcome. Sorry, I tried to make my type a bit larger and then it reset. Here we go. Or my font, I should say, not my type. I promise I'll stop scrolling on you guys in a second. Here we go. I hope that's the text is a bit easier to read. And I'm sorry, there's questions, Michelle.
My question, do we want to finish this conversation first before we move on to
Oh,
other
different
questions?
subject? Okay, yeah,
Yeah, different subject.
we can come back to it. Renee, do you have a different subject too, or?
Yeah, I was just going to speak to the original 506 1001 qualifications, probably same thing that Michelle was going to say, most likely, but yeah, so
Okay.
I'll wait.
Okay, and Deb, same thing, or were you hoping to weigh in on this?
I'm just thinking in terms of changes, I guess, relative to number 7 there. I would like to see a time limit, so that if there was one DUI 20 years ago, that, that wouldn't stop someone from being able to be hired. People make mistakes when they're young and stupid, young and foolish. And that's one change I'd like to see.
Okay. And are you thinking, and again, for the group, if it was one instance more than so long
Say
ago,
more
kind
than-
of fall into
more
here?
than
Jess, it
7
actually
years
says,
ago.
yeah, I was gonna say F actually says it gives a timeline, a time like 10 or more years ago.
So Deb, are you thinking maybe open it up a bit to include maybe a different time span, or maybe a different number? Because the way this reads, if it was one more than 10 years ago, no need to follow up with a waiver. If it was 25 years ago, you would still have to follow up with a waiver.
I was not aware that one more than 10 years ago wasn't a problem. Where does it say that?
That would be, so right in here.
But that's requiring a waiver, is that?
No, so there's still, there needs to be communication with the individual, the employer. I mean, as we update these rule
Yeah,
sets, this is
I
this
get-
is a
I
good
guess
example of,
frankly, I'd like to see that eliminated if it's more than 10 years ago.
okay, so the recommendation is to
instance,
keep this, really.
In our situation, when we hire someone, it isn't just to work with one person, like in enhanced family care. Our staff have contacts with all 20 people who we provide services for. So then to try and get permission from 20 guardians and 6 different area agencies, it's just kind of ridiculous.
Okay. So that's a really good conversation for this group. I think, and this is a theme that's coming up, is really balancing individual choice, control, informed decisions with a provider's ability to respond to and ensure appropriate supports are available. That includes appropriate staffing. So any other thoughts on that recommendation to maybe either eliminate or update the process here, and how we ensure that everybody's involved in that conversation, or not?
There's a couple of comments on chat.
Oh, okay. Okay, so Tyler, good morning, Tyler. So while it's important to have safety as the most important thing when it comes to clients, it also limits the availability to give service to clients in rural areas. If an individual has gotten detained or a recent criminal charge within 5 years, that is when we should deny it. If they have proof of a probation officer, evidence of the individual going through the therapy, etc., then that would be a good way to analyze and open up houses and thus more services. Thank you, Tyler. So maybe a recommendation to even reduce this to 5 years. And then have some considerations here about what else might be evaluated in terms of onboarding someone. I don't want to keep ignoring Renee and Michelle, but I just want to check in and make sure that that's not new hands on this conversation. Okay, so definitely the takeaway is, when we prepare something, to have a look to see if this is too restrictive, and maybe what Lindsay and I can do is think about some other alternatives that we can bring back to you guys and see if we've kind of gotten us closer to the mark of that balance, considering current needs of our service system. Okay, let me put the presentation back up. All right, all right, so the next question we had, I forget whose hand was up next. I think it was Michelle.
So I just wanted to maybe talk about the TB test issue a little bit. we are in 13 different states, and New Hampshire is the only state that still has a TB test requirement. It's 2023, there are medications and whatnot, and there are so many other more communicable diseases that we don't worry about. So I'm just throwing it out there because more recently, during CERT, they're asking for TB tests for other adults in the home, which they never did before, which never made sense to me because you were only testing the provider, but there were other people who could be transmitting TB. Now we have to test everyone. It's a huge expense. It's a huge issue, and it's kind of an unfunded mandate that I know a lot of us struggle with. The other piece of it is a lot of our providers, I would say the majority of our providers, are from countries that inoculate against TB. So when you do a TB test, it always comes out positive. So those folks then have to go have a chest x-ray or that new blood test that's available, which is another burden, another cost, and a delay in getting people started. So just throwing it out there. I don't know what other people think about that. I don't want to be the person that, poo-poos public health, but is this the one thing that we want to continue to require when no one else really does?
That's a great question. And I don't want to put anyone on this line on the spot, but for some folks who have possibly been involved in our services for a period of time, does anybody have any recollection from a historical standpoint of where this might have come from, or maybe what might have prompted it?
I
My
know it's
understanding is it's
required of teachers, or at least it used to be when I was teaching.
Yep.
But I remember when we opened 20 years ago, being told by, what was his name? It was a different Peter, not Peter Bacon. At any rate, that it was an out of
That was
date.
probably Pete Stone.
Yes, he said, this is an out of date mandate. I don't know why that's still required, but it is. And I think if it was out of date 20 years ago, it's even more out of date today.
That's helpful to know. And I think what we can do is see if we can find a little information. One of the things whenever we seek to change something, I like to take a minute and just figure out, is there any history behind this? Was there a really good, solid reason why this came about? And the reason it doesn't feel like it's an issue now is because it's working and doing what it was meant to do? Or is it just truly a practice that is no longer required due to all kinds of different things in our communities as years go on, and maybe it's something we can move from? So I can kind of ask the audience and talk to a couple of other folks who've been engaged and participating in our service system for some time, and see if there's any other insight. And if not, we can take that back and figure out how, and if there's a higher authority out there that says that we have to do it. And if not, we'll see what our options are to update that.
Yes, my understanding is that the requirement would come and go based on community outbreak.
Okay.
So I don't know who weighs in on this today, but we had a director of nursing here, and a few years back now. But I asked him, why does this keep, like, you'd see it be a requirement, then it wouldn't, then it was again. So I don't know if that still weighs in or not, but that was certainly something discussed in the past.
That's helpful. That's helpful information. So we can maybe check and see with DPH, or see if there's a statute somewhere that that prescribes it or requires it. And if not, this is all helpful for us, I think, in considering whether we want to continue it on, or whether we want to start updating language, starting with our proposed waiver services, and then maybe with any 506, 1001, 507, all of those rules that we would have to update to start moving in the future direction. And Krista.
Yes, I'm wondering, just because it's difficult for me to go back and forth between the DSP subcommittee report and this page, would you be willing to, because there are recommendations there for minimum qualifications for DSPs, would you be willing to go to page 16 of that report and pull it up just so that we could review that? And then in terms of the DSW, what is BDS doing in terms of pulling that in? Because there are minimum provider qualification recommendations there as well. So what is BDS doing in terms of that? Because just to refresh people's DSD direct service worker for self-directed families, there was a recommendation there that self-directed families or self-directed under the self-directed model, people could hire individuals under that model without it's a different minimum training requirements and different educational requirements without certification, and they could be it's just a different model, and I'm wondering what BDS's decision was regarding that model. So if you could pull that up, if you'd be willing to pull that up, just to take time to look at those qualifications, just so we're not flipping back and forth between those.
No, that's fine. And I have it here. I just want, if you could take a quick peek at it, Krista, when I put it on the screen, just to make sure. I always get nervous with version control. This is what I believe is the most up-to-date version. At least that's what I've been reviewing in preparation for our meeting today. Okay, page 16. Did I do the right screen? Do you all see the report, or do you see yourselves?
I see the report.
Okay, good.
I see the
All right.
report.
So 16 is the DSW. Krista, do you want to start up here? Or you've got some credentialing. Here's DSP, or do you want to start with the conversation around
So
self-directed?
let me check, because for me 16 is, you're right, the direct service worker. Sorry about that.
No, that's okay. Okay,
I just want to make sure we're on, like you said, we're on the same. Provider qualifications for DSP is page 13. You're correct.
so let me let folks have a second to kind of review, refresh. So this would be the individual specific training that would be required for, I believe the recommendation was for all DSPs. And then within the first 6 months of employment, I'll scan just a little bit, I'll scroll, but please folks don't hesitate to raise a hand and ask me to go back. So first 6 months.
Renee has her hand up.
Oh, Renee.
I just want to be careful in mixing up qualifications for someone to be hired
Yep.
and what the plan is for training once they're hired. I think that, these recommendations to me look like recommendations for training after someone is hired, when right now what we're discussing is what are the qualifications needed for someone to just be hired as a direct support associate? And then we move on to all of the training afterwards. So I just want to be careful, to not mix that up when we're looking at this, because we're looking at 506 and 1001, which is just the basic requirements for being hired.
So I think some of these might fall in, so universal precautions. Maybe initially. I think.
But these are trainings. These
Yeah,
aren't
they are.
requirements. So
I
trainings
think-
and requirements are different.
Right. I think it might be further down. There's there.
There
No,
we
that's
go. Minimum qualifications. Sorry about that.
Yeah, sorry.
Got
So
you on
that's
the wrong
the
page.
direct service worker with the age and the criminal background check. So what is BDS? Are they separating out a direct service worker? Because the minimum
No.
qualifications are different.
this looks like it's more used for families,
Right.
Yeah,
right? And maybe like, and I'm sure so many of us call it different titles, but something along the lines of a family managed employee,
mhm,
Yes.
mhm.
right? Because, you know, coming from organizations hiring employees. we-
So
we
this, the
really stay
direct
away from
service,
hiring relatives.
right, so the direct service worker language comes from CMS, just to try to make it more uniform. So that's the language that we pulled out of the CMS guide.
Renee, you had a question?
Oh. No, I just needed to lower my hand.
Right,
Sorry.
and then, I mean, if you want to look at the orientation and training later, that certainly makes sense, but the minimum, I'm sorry, the minimum qualifications, I think, is important.
Yeah.
Because that's what we were looking at before.
Is there one?
Jessica, Michelle's got her hand up too. Do you want her to
Oh.
go ahead?
Hi, Michelle. Yes.
I just wanted to, just to kind of reiterate what Renee said, that we seem to be confusing training with qualifications, and we should be focusing on waiver and regs and that kind of stuff. But on the other hand, you know, this stuff is all wonderful, and I appreciate the committee that came together and put this together. But is this actually it? Is this set in stone, or is this going to be put out there for public comment and review? Or are we just being told this is what everybody's going to need to do going forward? I'm a little confused.
That's not so I think that the committee worked really hard to provide this recommendation to BDS, but that our group really should be taking a look at this as we are processing through provider qualifications and figuring out if all of these best practices or recommendations rather are what we want to propose. And if not, if there are pieces of it, or I do think that there is a lot of this makes good sense. And that there was a pretty broad stakeholder group that participated in creating and developing these recommendations. But I'm not of the impression that it's set in stone. I think it's really good information for us to keep and to utilize and kind of look at as a guide almost to what stakeholders are feeling makes the most sense for provider qualifications. As we read through it at BDS, though, I think you guys would agree, and we can rotate this recommendation again if folks want to take it offline and take a read. A lot of it makes sense. It seems to be the right direction to move into, but I don't think BDS is hoping to prescribe to us into this group through this process what will or won't be done.
Can I just share that, you know, this really was, so I was on the subcommittee, and this really was a very time limited group. And that the expectation and the hope of the group was that there would be an additional group that would continue the work of this group. And a recommendation that was made, and it was under the heading of governance, was that these recommendations would be taken and developed further so that they could be implemented. So there, like the recommendations as a whole, and that there would be like another group that would be dedicated just to figuring out how these could be implemented, what the impact would be on provider agencies and area agencies and DSPs and families, and that there really would be another dedicated group to figure all of that out. And so I think to, you know, for this group to look at the report and to kind of pull pieces out and figure that out, I think that's a huge ask of this group. So I just want to share that from my perspective. I think that's a lot for this group to try to do.
Yeah, I think really the hope for this group, and as I said, we can recirculate the recommendation, is to talk to folks to see what's working, what do we want to keep, what do we want to improve upon, and what do we maybe want to move away from that's currently out there. And then to consider this report in conjunction with that, as well as some advice and good direction and what we want to move towards. And then once we figure it out and created some provider qualifications, my hope is that that would be the linkage back to how we go about operationalizing and applying all of this. What did we keep and what did we take from that recommendation to, let's say there was a group developed in that capacity, Krista, it would really help to kind of form their charter and what they're operationalizing and what they're trying to get in place. So it is a little bit right now of still kind of conceptual because we're figuring out what do we like, what do we not like, what do we think is right for the service system, and making the next step from there. So I think we will make sure to send that back out because the onboarding requirements are still very important. They're critical to successful service provision and service participation for sure. I hear what you guys are saying though, in terms of, hey, you know, let's kind of, if we were to take this into two steps, first, what's required to hire someone, and then what's required to allow that new hire to provide services. And we can approach it that way so that we don't have too much overlap as we're trying to brainstorm. But we have some chats. Oh, Tyler asks, would these qualifications be something an individual with disabilities would go through as well if they wanted to get into human services? Oh, that's a great idea, Tyler. Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think going through and participating in some of the requirements and the curriculum or the trainings that are outlined are a great opportunity for individuals as well to be aware from that perspective too of what's being asked of folks that are working with them and how that plays out. I think that's always a positive. And there are some training curriculums out there that offer various modules that are intended to be done with a new DSP, for example, and the individual. So that's a great opportunity, and especially if someone was hoping to move into into human services. And then Tyler asks, the requirements should be the following. So a high school diploma, a general life skills or an understanding of human services or individuals with disabilities, and any college degrees, certificates, et cetera, should be considered a bonus. So Tyler's proposing high school diploma and some sort of competency in general life skills or human services. What do you guys think about that recommendation?
I agree. We used to have a requirement of a high school diploma or GED, and that was done away with, I believe, a few years ago. Personally, I think it should still be a requirement. And my hand was up previously because on the other slide, CPR and first aid were listed as requirements or prospective requirements to be hired. And I would see that as a training once hired.
Right.
Yeah, we already have the requirement of a high school degree or equivalent thereof. And actually, we used to do CPR all the time, and then we stopped. So now we offer it as a training if they want to participate. But we were running into issues with forcing people to do CPR.
CPR and first, I mean, we do that with our new hire training, and we try to make sure people are updated, but there's a real cost involved with that too. So it's not just, you know, having a CPR trainer on staff, which we do have many, but it is a cost to an agency to make sure that people are trained in CPR. We do CPR and AED, but we do not do first aid because there's additional cost with first aid. So, you know, I think, again, thinking about the training separately from requirement and looking at ways to, you know, there's a lot of initiatives out there now for training for the direct support professionals. You know, we're embarking on a collaboration with the National Association of Direct Support Professionals to put together training that will meet their credentialing, and very much like what Krista's report said, DSP 1, 2, 3. But it's very costly. It's very time consuming. There are some grants out there now that we're looking at for workforce development. And I think a lot of other vendors are looking at doing initiatives like that. But I think, again, let's look at that separately from qualification.
Okay. So let's kind of take that approach, but I mean, I think relatively quickly we'll be able to kind of outline, or at least, in our minds have an outline of both. What does it take to be hired? And then once someone's hired, what are the trainings, which if we kind of step back, I think also included in what you just highlighted, Renee, is from a provider agency, a resource commitment as well to ensure that those trainings are able to be completed. And that us knowing, I think that'll be particularly important for our colleagues in the rate work group as they start talking about the rate for some of these services. If we, as a group, come up with some recommendations for credentialing requirements, training requirements, so that they can take a look at, okay, what do those resources mean in terms of a rate development?
So thank you for that clarification. I think it's very helpful to say that we're going to take that approach as we move forward, thinking about initial hiring expectations and then provider qualifications once somebody's hired, and just clearly, for me, separating that in terms of our discussion. So when I thinking about moving forward under the certified community residences, especially thinking about how an individual is going to be receiving services and thinking about budgets and all of that sort of thing. So looking at the qualifications to be hired for certified community residents, and then how somebody would be receiving services. For me, I would think about a DSP 1, 2, or 3, those. That's different than what would be required for somebody that would be hired. Do you understand what I'm saying? So that would be based on the person's need that's in a certified community resident. So it's hard to look at that one little graphic there and have all of that information captured in that one graphic, at least the way that my brain is working.
You're not wrong. There's
and respond to that. So
yeah, this is the challenge here, I think, is with and you reference this with regard to the work group's recommendation too. But I mean, I think the same is true of our rules and our requirements in general. There's quite a bit of information for us as a group to try to glean quickly in order to level set and have the conversation moving forward about what's working, what's not working, what do we want to change or update. So, I mean, I think what we have here are some of the more standout provisions, some of the ones that even folks have asked as well over the years and various
right
for various reasons. Can we?
So I guess
for me, can we move on?
Instead of saying existing provider qualifications, if this were to say hiring requirements for providers, that would be more clear to me. Is this what we're discussing here? Hiring requirements for providers.
I do
It's
think
actually ongoing, because these things are reviewed at search for all employees or home providers have to have these items all the time. So yeah, these are all initial things that are done, but it's not necessarily hiring, it's qualifications for somebody to actually provide the service. That makes sense?
Okay, so when we were back on the last bubble, we wanted to just have a discussion about hiring requirements. We did not want to have a discussion about people who are providing the services. So it's not clear to me what we're discussing.
that's a fair question. So maybe we can start with the hiring component and then figure out how that moves down the path of ongoing. And then once we start talking about ongoing requirements, we can also include, okay, what are some of those things that have to be done in the first 6 months, the first year, and then annually thereafter, and how they kind of interact with each other, if we're thinking of it more like moving down a path, possibly. So in order to, and what folks are kind of sharing and what they've reached out to the Bureau in the past, some of these are areas that new agencies, or excuse me, agencies have asked for as prospective staff or an employee is, hey, is there a possibility to waive some of these requirements? You know, for our group to have a discussion, is there, you know, and folks brought up the TB test, for example. Staff being at least 18 years of age. I think that's a pretty tried and true. There have been instances where folks have asked for flexibility there. You know, is that something that our group wants to make a recommendation on, or are we thinking that 18 seems like the best practice? You know, in order for an agency to even, let's say they've got the resume in front of them and they're trying to figure out, does this person meet the minimum requirements to be in the running for this job? What are those things? And then figure out, okay, once they're hired, what's the next step with that new staff or provider? So many requirements out there. I do think this essentially summarizes them. Anybody who's participated in a service file review, especially in organizing that on the area agency side and making sure everything exists, or if you've been on the provider side and the documentation's being requested of you, that all typically speaks to what these requirements are, especially when we're asking, hey, did they initially have a crim check done? Did they initially have all of these things done? Though, Krista, is super important to call out here, this is not an exhaustive list of every requirement we have out there. We've got a couple chats, but Tim.
Yeah, hi, good morning. Yeah, I guess when I listen to this, it's really, this is a minimum. These are the provider qualifications that should be the minimum. And like, you know, as we walk through it, there's some best case practices, like the CPR is probably a best case practice, probably having all your staff COVID vaccinated, having them have the flu shots, those type of things. The TB test, I don't know. It seems like you could probably have that as a best practice opposed to a bare minimum. So I think sometimes we're getting a little confused with the bare minimum, which is the provider qualifications, and the age comes into that. But I think probably under 18, you just need a waiver for those things, right? So, I mean, I think we just got to remember, this is the bare minimum to get in there. And in all organizations, like Renee said about CPR, they're probably actively doing CPR and they're spending money on it, and there's a cost associated, but they're trying to be the best that they can. But it shouldn't be the bare minimum that the staff has to be CPR you know, trained. It's something that is best practice the organization wants to do, and something that they can advertise to other, you know, clients and stuff like that. This is what we're trying to do. But I think we got to focus that this is the bare minimum that we need to make sure the organization or the individual is qualified. And then after that, it's really about the organization to train them up to their standards, if that helps.
No, I think that articulates it really well, Tim. And that's a point where I'm interested in hearing, particularly from folks in this group, where we start talking about bare minimum versus best practice. Is there anything that's a bare minimum that you all think is just a bit much, TB, for example, and how you've all articulated that? Is there anything right now that's a best practice that you all think should be a bare minimum? Shannon.
Well, Tim kind of stole my thunder, but he said a lot of things I was going to say. Because I think that the qualifications are both about onboarding people and what's their initial training to get them to work. I also think that oftentimes every service has a regulation that governs it, and that regulation, like for PDMS, for example, it also goes into qualifications. Yeah. So I think that's where you'll find, you know, where it's different per service. But this needs to be the bare minimum.
Yeah, and that might be when we set up our waiver. Hold on, let me just pull it up quick. Okay, so when we start getting into provider qualifications, of course, I've timed out. Can you all see my screen?
Jessica, while you're pulling that up, can I just respond? to hearing like bare minimum and the regulations. So family, there were families on the subcommittee, and we also, we were reaching out to families and individuals, and and I'm hearing like bare minimum, and as opposed to like what agencies are really wanting. And I think people are maybe feeling like we're wanting like the Cadillac version. And what I think you also know, like families are at either a bare minimum, or an individuals or like nothing. So I think just kind of keeping that in mind, and in terms of like adhering to the regulations and the we went in this thinking that we could change the regulations, and that group that was continuing on would look at the recommendations of this group and really what individuals and families were needing. The recommendation, and it wasn't just individuals and families, there were all different kinds of people representing different positions on this subcommittee, and changing those requirements based on what individuals and agencies were needing. So while going back and looking at the regs, I think it's important to look at what people were saying that they needed. So just sharing that too.
Yeah, so I think both things are true. We have regulations that outline and prescribe some of this information that we need to follow. When we make our recommendations, so from our group, once they are accepted and approved, and we get the go ahead to operationalize services in our state in this way, we'll go make sure that the rules reflect that. We want to make sure that that structure exists within our state administrative rules to grant that those requirements and really demonstrate them in a way that providers are able to look at. I hear what you're saying on the minimum requirements. So I think that's just how we're framing this up. So I'm just kind of envisioning if I were applying for a new job, I would probably be looking at a posting to see what those credentials are. And I might not apply for a job if I didn't meet those minimum requirements, but certainly not minimum in terms of once somebody's onboarded, trying to have, I don't think anyone's hoping to equate minimum standards with like a low bar or something like that. This would just be in the terms of how do I know if I'm even considering that line of work or that particular position, if I can even submit an application, and if it would be reviewed. And what I'm thinking here too is when we go through the waiver amendment and submit the provider qualifications, what we may have called out here would be, of course, if there's a particular license or certification or certificate requirement. But then in other standards, that might be our opportunity to jump in and say, okay, minimum criteria to even be considered for this position would be you're 18, you have, a GED or a high school diploma, you have, some of the other standards that we had outlined in the other table. If we keep TB, for example, that would probably be there. But then we might be able to say, okay, and once a provider is onboarded, here are the minimum training requirements, and set it up that way so that we kind of have all of this information included. Because what I am hearing is, for a number of reasons, it is all very important to the outcome, not just in service access, provision, and participation, but also to the provider's responsibilities and being able to meet those and make sure they have the appropriate resources. So if we have it laid out that it's a requirement, then that so too can be considered through the rate development process. So just sorry, not to bog everybody down with the waiver template, but I think we have an opportunity here to touch on all of these important points through the creation of the provider qualification. Oh, I'm going to look at the chat box quick because there's a few in there. So Tyler's asking if there are any services in New Hampshire that are considered entry level. I'm not quite sure, and I would probably defer to our group on the line if they have positions that are considered entry level within organizations. And what that might mean. Do you mean, Tyler, specific to service provision, or maybe somebody might be able to get, their foot in the door at a provider agency, for example, maybe I don't know what might be considered it's hard to come up with an entry level position because I think they all have complexities to them, but maybe somebody might consider an administrative support position, helping with various filing and clerical responsibilities to be entry level, but then they're working for that entity and maybe have the opportunity to participate in some development either through the agency or personally to work on meeting minimum requirements for a step up and maybe step into a service provider role. Is that kind of what you were hoping to learn, Tyler? Michelle, did you have?
I was just going to answer that. I mean, technically, all DSP positions are entry level. You have to meet minimum requirements, but they are entry level positions in that they're not management. You don't have to have any kind of experience. So, when I think of entry level, it means you don't have to have experience. But you do have to have minimum requirements. So, does that make sense?
I think that's helpful to explain it in an important distinction between entry level and minimum experience as well. And Tyler said another thing is that some positions should allow individuals to go through practicum, not a requirement, but places like LRCS don't allow practicums, which is really disappointing. And so I think when folks are commenting, just definitely we have our perspectives from the various regions we grow up, I'll say, for example, but I don't think to imply that any one particular region might be the only one following that process. But thank you for your experience, Tyler, too, and how you're trying to navigate through some of these things that could be opportunities for the state. So I'll take that back, practicum. Okay. And then, okay, Deb is going to be rejoining by phone if she's not already in. So just heads up to us if we see a phone number come into the gallery, it will likely be Deb. You're welcome, Tyler. Okay, and we have one Q&A. Anonymous attendee, will we get a copy of the document we are seeing now, the direct service worker qualifications Word document? So just an important information for folks observing, that was a recommendation that was created from a DSP workforce subcommittee. And what they are proposing are recommendations that is not a developed or a process that has been adopted into any of these requirements, or that anybody, and when I say this, I mean it with all due respect to that work group, because they have some excellent recommendations that I think we're likely to adopt in various ways. But it doesn't necessarily mean that because we're sharing and discussing it here that it's been approved and, from this work group, and certainly not, our advisory committee or BDS as a whole, that we've, definitely accepted and are moving forward with those. So I don't believe the report is being shared broadly. I might be incorrect there. We can look into it, but for folks observing, just to know that this is more conversation and context for our group as we're figuring out where we are now and where we're hoping to move with that criteria. Okay, so just hop to the next slide. So in looking at some of the requirements from a certification and licensing standard, I think that the information that we have now, I mean, some of what we just looked at on the past or the previous slide, as I mentioned, are areas that I think did warrant a discussion from our group. Certainly not the only ones, but ones that in the past folks have kind of said, hey, can we either seek a waiver or have another conversation about these criteria? The remainder, though, I think are pretty well either codified within our law or, outlined within our regulations when we talk about licensing and certification criteria. And that full process that's outlined being that kind of guidance on the minimum qualification, or excuse me, the provider qualifications. So right now that we really don't require additional qualifications beyond what's outlined in 1001 or what might be in the statute. Is it 151? I'm going to misquote that, so please don't take it. The statute that outlines our licensing criteria and requirements. We did a quick scan, not a quick scan at all. We did a scan of our peer states, and they too have a very similar process where they don't necessarily, or they don't typically require qualifications beyond what is prescribed for in either their licensing or if they have a similar certification process to our state. Some of them only prescribe for licensing. So New Hampshire kind of is a front runner there a little bit in terms of how we're approaching that and requiring the certification for 3 or fewer or supporting 3 or fewer individuals and licensing for 4 or more. High school education, background check clearances, emergency skill, competency, privacy skills, and communication skills. So with that in mind, and with some of the information before, I certainly have your recommendations already on the last slide. Are you guys feeling like for these 3 services anyway, when we're talking about largely a staffed residence, even if there's a specialty, the way we've developed it in our service definitions, anything beyond the licensing and certification requirements that you guys might offer? Okay. Renee.
I think that, you know, and I'm just speaking for us, if you at Easter Seals, if you're following the rules and the regulations for certification and licensing, that is a lot, and that is enough. I think that if you want to, you know, I don't want to see us muddy up the waters and make it more difficult for providers to actually provide services in the state, because, you know, we need all the providers that we can get. And if we start to add on above the rules, I think we're going to be, you know, putting a lot of smaller providers or other, you know, vendors in some sticky situations, which I would never want to see happen. So I think that, you know, if you're following rules and regulations for licensing and certification, that's a lot and it's enough, but that's my opinion.
Thank you, Renee.
I agree with Renee.
Thank you, Michelle.
So this is Krista. I'm not great at raising my hand. I can try to be better if you like.
Okay, Chris.
I'm wondering about so just from a family perspective and from just reading and connecting with others about requiring a specialty certification for DSPs working with people with dual diagnosis in the intensive treatment services residences, or if that's more relevant in community participation services. If you can educate me about that a little bit, Renee.
So I think that once again, you have to separate the rule with the training. So if you are a vendor that's providing intensive treatment services, then there's an extensive amount of training that goes into play for the people who are providing services in that area. It really doesn't have anything to do with the rule and the licensing and the certification of the program. So training and licensing and certification are very different. So each of these different models have different training requirements according to the needs of the individuals and the program that you are providing the services in. So I think that, you know, again, separating that is important, because yes, training is very different in intensive treatment services than it would be in a community residence providing supports to people with autism. So it's different, but that's more training and not licensing and certification.
So are you talking about so this is provider qualifications. So I think I'm having some language problems here, and I appreciate your patience with me. So the community residence intensive treatment services, to me, we're discussing about people who are providing the services within the community residence. Is that correct?
Like the direct support associates within those areas of that scope of practice.
Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. So for me, I would want somebody starting in that program who is qualified to provide those services. I'm not
Mhm.
talking about the training program. I want somebody on day one in an intensive treatment service program who is qualified to provide services day one.
Mm-hmm. And the vendor that
So-
provides those services will
Mhm.
typically address that in the job description. So job descriptions for people who are providing services in an intensive treatment services per vendor can decide, how much experience do we want people to have? How much, time do we want them to have spent in a community like that?
Mhm.
So that is left a little bit up to the vendor. But again, that is different than following rules and licensing and certification.
Mhm.
So are you, in kind of listening to this conversation, Krista, are you maybe asking the group to weigh in on whether that minimum criteria should include, for example, if typically in our criteria, we require a GED or high school diploma, an example of what a step that could be made or offered by our group would be if you are providing services in an intensive treatment service model home, that you have a bachelor's degree with a focus on, something that might speak towards those additional supports? Or does the group think that leaving that experience in credentialing requirement per SJT is a best practice?
I don't know it sounded like you used an acronym there and I don't know what that.
It's the
Sorry.
job description. She was just saying, leaving that up to the vendor to put that in the job description.
Thank you.
Which I very much would strongly suggest that is the way that it's left, so that the vendor can prescribe by job description, what will be necessary to employ someone in a program like that. If we start to get prescriptive about that in rules and licensing, we're going to be in trouble.
Right. I would not want to be prescriptive about that because I think residences are so limited, but I think it's really important to ensure that there is language in there specific to that because the needs are so great and different. And I think you really need to have somebody who's qualified to address those needs. So I'm not sure exactly what the language would be, but I think it's really important to ensure that do you know what I'm saying? I think, Renee, I know that you know what I'm saying.
Yeah, I do. I just, there aren't a lot of vendors that do intensive treatment services. It's a very limited group in New Hampshire right now that can provide that level of service. So, again, I think that those who are providing services like that have been very clear in job descriptions and very clear about the people. And, I think that, if we start to limit the ability to hire in those situations, we're going to be crippled, and the capacity is already, very challenging. So I think we need to give our vendors who provide these services a little bit of credit in, allowing for them to determine job descriptions and what a person needs for, experience and ability to work through in these services.
Okay.
So maybe what
Want
we
to chime in?
Well, I don't want to be prescriptive. I'm just wondering if we as a group can just look at what those qualifications are and just kind of weigh in on them and provide some input on that.
Shannon, I think I heard you come off mute.
Yeah.
Yeah, I did. I think I want to say a couple things. When it comes to onboarding staff, whether it's for a community residence or in ITS program, I think that the agency holds a lot of the responsibility and liability. And, you know, that helps us operationally, take very seriously that we have the right people in the right seats and in the right jobs. We don't provide ITS here at Region 3, but we do have a treatment program that we run. And so we did create, an additional position called a therapeutic DSP, where we do want somebody to have perhaps a higher level of education or experience. So yeah, I think some of the responsibility lies with the organization, but I agree with Renee that we can't get too prescriptive because the workforce is so slight right now, that we have to be sure not to tie our hands any further, or we're not going to be able to provide services, and that's really going to be awful. So I think here and other organizations as well, that we work hard to make sure that we have good training in place. So, that not only helps the people that we support, but it also helps us retain those employees. When we invest in them, that helps retain them.
Yeah.
So, I don't think we're looking for bare minimum so that we can put somebody terribly untrained or unqualified in place. I just wouldn't want to do that. And I don't think anybody else would either. But we sometimes are pretty desperate, I'm going to be honest. And I think that's where it would head. If we make it too restrictive, then we're just going to have to start to not be able to provide some of the services.
So
I
this
think
is,
the job description is the key.
yeah.
The job
Yes, I
description is
agree.
the key. And, most vendors who are providing ITS services are not going to put anybody at risk. It's a
Okay.
risky business to be in the first place. We're not going to put people at risk, whether it's the individual or the people working with them.
Or the community.
Exactly.
Yeah, which I think is important consideration to Shannon's point, where that kind of, not to talk liability, but a little bit, because those responsibilities and being able to follow through upon them when an agency can't, that becomes a liability, right? So, the agency ensuring that any staff that they have providing those services meet those requirements. And I think in consideration of Tim's point too before, where we have our requirements versus best practices. So what we can do, because I think this is an important conversation, really what I'm hearing is, hey, for staff services, staff residential services, and our vision of community residence apartments, what we have right now does seem to make sense. It's a tried and true best practice that's been really fine-tuned for New Hampshire and with New Hampshire in mind. But when we start approaching community residence intensive treatment services, is there anything else that needs to be included in the minimum requirements, the provider onboard requirements? And what Lindsay and I can do is talk to Josh Galing from BDS, our clinical administrator, to see if from his perspective and in his observation and working with providers, especially and specifically providers who are offering services that are either intensive treatment service specific, or, services that are accounting for things that are relevant or related areas, I guess I'll say. And if there are some maybe minimum requirements that he would recommend we consider, and we can bring those back and have a conversation with the group about that to see, does that make sense? Does it seem too prescriptive even still, or does that feel like a move that makes sense for New Hampshire? Okay. And Tyler put another comment in the chat box as well around and what does this mean in terms of interaction with community mental health agencies too. And I think that's helpful, especially when as we've developed the service definition and what some of those expectations might be from a service provision standpoint, if not per individual, per staff, who might be providing the service. So how our systems all talk to each other. So then too, when we kind of get into services that are provided in someone's own home or in their family's home, and as I mentioned, shared living or enhanced family care services, kind of for the purpose of this conversation, falling into the category that's more of a service provided in your own home. And we still follow our 1001 and our 506 criteria for a certified residence or a licensed shared family living home. We took a look at Massachusetts, Connecticut. Well, we took a look at several states of Massachusetts and Connecticut. Also require that staff, so for minimum criteria, to demonstrate proficiency and competencies needed to support an individual as described in their service agreement. So that might be moving more into the territory of once someone's hired, how do you determine if that provider, that DSP, for example, is a good fit for a individual who's looking to participate in services? Or it could be that there are certain things when we think social role valorization, some of the trainings that we have right now in those first 6 months, general familiarity with our service system. What I'm kind of hearing from the group is there's not necessarily a recommendation at this point in time to move some of those first 6-month trainings into minimum requirements. Are there any of those other first 6-month trainings? And please, anybody who knows those well, or more in a way that they might be able to throw some of them out there. I'm thinking overview of developmental services systems, overview health and safety. Some of those trainings that might be a little more universal to all staff and not specifically onboarding, or are you guys thinking maybe we leave those in the onboarding process and not in minimum or criteria to be hired or considered for a position? And
Jessica,
also, sorry, question down here, any specific characteristics of an enhanced family care, a shared living home that might require any unique provider qualifications? Sorry, Krista, go ahead.
Thank you. I was asking you to clarify your question because I wasn't clear on what you were asking.
Yeah, so right now, I think when we're looking at, so before we were looking at services in the context of those staffed residences, provider owned and operated residents where folks live, and staff who are typically working in shifts would come in and provide the services and then they would leave. These services are all provided in someone's own home, their apartment, maybe their family's home. And with enhanced family care, they're living with a family, and that is their home where they live, and the services are provided from that shared living provider. So when we're thinking now in a different context, so a different grouping of services, so to speak, those minimum criteria that we saw on that slide up above still apply to these services, to the extent that any of those services fall under 1001, so shared family living, enhanced family care. Are there any of the things that we said are further down the path, for example, some of the training requirements, that when we start talking about services in this context, we might think should be moved over to the minimum, the onboarding requirement, and not the after I've been hired? No, I'm saying that wrong. The criteria to be hired and not the training once somebody is onboarded. Something that might be a little more universal to all staff, especially where these staff will be going into someone's home to provide the services. Or are we still thinking as a group that definitely a distinction between minimum criteria to be considered for a job versus onboarding after the fact?
I'm
And you
still
have a
not
couple
clear
minutes.
on, still not clear on what the question is, but I'll wait for some discussion. That was,
So let me try to do.
that's okay. I'll just wait. That was just a lot of language for me.
Okay.
I'll wait for some
I'm
discussion.
sorry. My concern is if I'm not, if you have a question, other people probably have the same question. So good idea. We'll see if through some of the feedback, either folks are saying, no, Jess, you did not make a whole lot of sense when you explain that, or maybe in their examples, it'll be helpful. And if not, we can keep going through it. Michelle.
Just trying to distill this down a little bit. In 2019, the 1001 HEMs were amended to basically include all of the same trainings that DSPs get for home providers. So they're already, all of those things are already encompassed in the HEMs for both DSPs and home providers. You mentioned overview of developmental services, empowerment, advocacy, all of those things were already added to be completed within the first 6 months of hire. So I think the current provider qualifications are sufficient. And then I think the following 6 months trainings are sufficient from a regulatory standpoint. And then anything that the individual provider feels is necessary for best practice can then be added on. I don't think that getting more prescriptive in this is a good idea. So just my 2
so
cents.
leave them in the first 6 months and then annually thereafter, or however they're articulated now. Don't take anything from that group and move it to a requirement in order to be hired.
Because right now it's as Tim used, I like that Tim said the bare minimum, but individual rights and all those things that people need right away before they start working. And also learning about the individual, and we call it qualification for service provision. Every home provider goes through all of those items the day they start or before they start, and they get 16 hours of one-on-one if they're inexperienced. So all of those things are already in place, and I don't think we need to continue to kind of beat this dead horse just to be
Yeah, so the question here would be more, those are in place, and I don't think anybody's recommending a different decision that we would have to go forth and update the rule. I think the question to the group here would be, say, rights. Would anybody in the group recommend moving rights from, hey, if you don't already have that competency, we're going to make sure you have it on day one? Or would we move it to, we want you to come to the table with that competency. We want you, when you're applying for employment, to already show that you have knowledge, skills, or abilities in that area.
We do that training basically the first day. We do all that training. So there's things people need to get hired, which are your background checks and all of those things. And then any subsequent training is either done day one or within the first 6 months.
Okay. And I think that also kind of speaks to Tyler's point too, around, ensuring that for the good of the system, it remains a position that's available to folks if they don't have that competency, that the provider will make sure they get that training. So thank you.
We don't require anyone to have client rights training before they even get the job. That would be silly. So it's nice if they have it, then we can, mark it up, but we usually do our own anyway, because that's such an important item.
Okay. Renee.
I was going to say that one thing that might be helpful is to pull up like the certification packet, that face sheet that shows all of the training that someone needs to have prior to and then ongoing, because that really is directly by rule. And it shows, everything that you need to have prior to service, everything that you need within the next 6 months, and it's all linked back to rule. That might be just helpful, to see that. And I mean, I know what it looks like, but you don't have to do it now, Jess, but I'm just saying like that certification packet, that piece it's just very clear in what a vendor needs to do. And again, you can get more prescriptive in like this person's specific orientation or the behavior, because that talks about the behavior plan and the risk management plan, all of the different plans. So if you kind of scroll down to where the training piece comes in.
Let me just make it nope. Let me keep it that big. Sorry. I think that this is helpful to take a moment on, Renee, though, to kind of demonstrate to folks who aren't as familiar with the certification process how extensive it is.
It is very, very extensive, and you have to, for every staff member, you have to have, all of this filled in on a certification pack. It's not right. You got to go to the next.
I only have 2 pages here, but I don't think I have the entire packet.
No,
that's
a request. So then there's life safety, but then there's like the certification packet. You opened up the application, not the packet, and we don't have to take the time now, but I'm just thinking that that definitely is going to be something helpful for people to see if they're not used to seeing what are the trainings required within rule.
It
Can
might
you,
be this
could you,
one.
could you share that with us? Like, could you send that out to us so we can, with our group, so we can see that? That would be helpful.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering too, I think it would be helpful. And I think it's hard to switch between documents. But I think to do a crosswalk between that and then the subcommittee's report on page 13 with those requirements, because I think there would be a lot of overlap, but I think that the committee did come up with some new things that they would like people to be to have in their training. And I think if you're having a home provider or whatever you call it, I think that would be something to be considered, because if it's a residential provider, I think that the person would want to have that knowledge before they had somebody living with them, or that I think that's important. And I know we're talking about qualifications versus training, but I think if someone is going to be living with them, I think that they need to have some knowledge before they're living together.
And
So
in the rule and
there
all
could-
the trainings required by certification have all of that in there.
Right, which is why I said if we could do a crosswalk between those two documents, I think it would be really helpful. And I think it's difficult to flip between documents on a screen. So while we don't want to call it training, I think maybe the language I'm using isn't correct. I think maybe information areas or qualification areas, or whatever language you want to use. I think doing that crosswalk, I think, would be really helpful with the document that you referred to, Renee. Thank you.
So I do want to give us a little bit of time to talk about in-home personal care, which would be a new service to our waiver. Right now, the certification process for this, because it's considered a self-directed service, would be our HEM 525. In that care, I think 521 as well outlines this, but with 525 allowing it to happen in the individual's family home. And what we're proposing is opening the service up essentially so that it's not only available if somebody desires to self-direct their services. But with that said, that doesn't necessarily mean that our group wouldn't propose some sort of certification for this service. Massachusetts does have a certification process, for example. So this is where, a conversation around, are there any differences when we start talking about maybe onboarding those requirements for training, and also the minimum requirements, minimum staff requirements to be considered for a position that might be unique to this type of service being provided? So our service definitions in a lot of instances offer the same supports. Where they're provided seems to be how we separated them into their own distinct service category. So I think that if we were to look at it from the perspective of maybe having staff in an agency who might meet the requirements to provide that service in various different settings, and how we approach setting up recommendations for provider qualifications with that in mind, versus any type of requirements either before someone's even hired, what they bring to the table, or what they might be trained in after being hired that might be unique or different to service provision in someone's own home or their family home or an EFC. Michelle.
For this particular thing, we might want to look at some agencies that do home care. What are their requirements for their PCSPs?
Okay.
Personal care support professionals. They're not necessarily certified, but they do have specific requirements. And not to throw Renee under the bus, but I know Easter Seals does some of that. We used to do some of that as well. So might be a good
Yeah.
idea to just maybe tap into that rather than reinvent the wheel.
Sure.
That we would
Mhm.
follow everything under the CFI waiver.
Right.
So we would just look to that rule, which is what we do at Easter Seals, because we do in-home support. We do provide personal care under the CFI waiver. So we follow everything under that CFI rule.
And I can, certainly imagine from a provider standpoint, that would offer some flexibility in order to respond to service needs across pay sources where, the waivers essentially are offering very similar services. Just to different, like waivers are separated by target groups of folks that you're trying to provide those services to, but the service itself may be the same. So we'd be creating or at least or allowing to continue flexibility in that service provision by doing that. Shannon.
Yeah, we provide a lot of in-home care to elders and people with chronic illness. We do it through a federal block grant for Title 20 and 3B. We do it through CFI. So the onboarding of all of our frontline caregivers, regardless of their title, is the same. You have to be 18 years old. You have to have a high school diploma or equivalent GED. You have to have a clear background check, or, we could apply for a waiver depending on what the situation is, but that's on a case by case. I would say overall, you have to come in with, a clean background, and both criminally and through driving. So all of that is the same for all of our onboarding. And then it gets very specific to the care needs of the individual, what's in their care plan, and what their case managers are asking for services. And so then that's where our training could deviate a little bit, right? If somebody has a lift system, then we have to train specifically to that lift system. So it really depends on what the individual's care needs are to then the client specific training.
That's really helpful. So I think it kind of fits with the takeaways today as well that I have in terms of what do we need to make sure that individual is a good fit for that particular line of work, so to speak, our minimum qualifications. And then once they come to the agency or once they're hired on, what are the minimum training requirements that are expected for everyone? And then how do we determine which staff or which provider might be a good fit to work with a specific individual in mind, and what's outlined in their service agreement or their care plan, if it's a CFI service, all of these different, all of the various plans that might help to inform additional training. Renee, I saw your hand up.
It was really just basically what Shannon said. Our onboarding requirements are the same for our employees. And if they were working, under the DD waiver, then, the training would be different under different waivers for in-home personal care. Like we have a personal care support professional lab that's taught by a nurse. So, people who are working in-home for, under those waivered services go through the PCSP lab. Same with the DD waiver too. So it just depends on the job. Onboarding is the same. It's just the training that's different.
Okay. Thank you.
I think the only thing I want to add to that is just to clarify, we don't bring home providers on as employees. They are individual, independent contractors for us. But we do, the onboarding is the same, regardless of their status, whether they're an employee or a contractor. Our onboarding requirements are the same.
Okay, so helpful info, because that would be the info that a provider would include in their contract for if there were onboarding requirement. Okay, so. Okay. All right, and then the last maybe 15, almost 20 minutes to talk about stabilization services, whether provided in the home or out of home. So really this is, similar to what we utilize for crisis right now, but I think as we all step back to see how we utilize crisis, it was typically for additional staff supports to assist and, approved 6 months at a time. We've kept that same structure and offered this service. Now, right now, no similar service in our system exists to base provider qualifications upon. With crisis services, depending if you access crisis funding, I should say, the providers are still ensuring that whatever that service or that support is, it's being provided, that it's still meeting the criteria for that particular service. So it's an interesting combination, or an interesting way that we've approached it in the state so far. When we looked at other states, we saw some interesting add-ons, and I think this speaks to Krista's point before around ITS services, but we noticed that some states, and Connecticut's listed here as an example, might require additional experience for some staff with a background in mental health service support, for example, maybe special education or other services that might be particularly helpful for someone who's experiencing a event that's leading to request a stabilization type support, additional staffing. With that in mind, does anybody in the group feel like, when we talk stabilization services for someone to be able to provide that, would the same provider qualifications for residential, shared living, for example, be appropriate to provide the additional support? Or would different criteria be appropriate in this circumstance? Shannon.
I think overall it's the same. I think it does get to a very case by case situation, depending on what's going on and the level of support that an individual needs. Oftentimes crisis is, as you said, Jess, providing additional staff hours, to give that home provider an additional break. Like weekends can be super long when you're dealing with an individual who could be in crisis of some type, if you're the home provider. So oftentimes as an organization, we look to our DSP group to see who would be willing to pick up some additional hours and provide some weekend support, because that individual's, in a heightened state, and we don't want our home providers to burn out, so we've got to support them. And then there are some times that, depending on the individual, there might be an additional training. I think we would, as an organization, be out in front of that, if they needed some entry-level training around trauma-informed care, or, a particular mental health diagnosis, to know how to best support them and interact with them. But I would say, for something like this, that's going to be kind of a broad stroke. It's just drawing from our existing provider home, DSP pool, to provide those crisis. I don't know if Renee or Michelle have other experiences, but
I think you're right, Shannon. It's usually just somebody just needs some support in the home. So bringing in another DSP or another home provider, and where the DSP and home provider qualifications are the same, so the basic stuff is the same, but there might be training on a behavior plan needed, or maybe there's training on the physical or medical issues that would have to be done. But for basic qualifications, I think they should be the same as DSPs and home providers. And I know that, their comments around the mental health issue, maybe around the mental health diagnosis. If someone is at a point of crisis, then they need to go somewhere where they can get full crisis services. But just to help somebody stabilize, give the home provider a break, I think basic qualifications are fine.
So the
Yeah,
basic.
sorry, Jess.
No, you go ahead, Renee.
I was just gonna say, I agree with that. I mean, it's generally just providing extra support. And quite honestly, the stabilization services out of home are not that plentiful in New Hampshire. There's not a lot of opportunity for people to receive stabilization outside of their home. So very often it is on us as the service provider to, pull in clinical, pull in, other staff members, pull in any resource that we have to wrap around that individual in crisis, whether it's in a home care provider or in a staffed residence, because there's not a lot available for us to send to. We can't send to the hospital. They won't keep them. We can't send to, there just aren't places for people to go to have crisis stabilization at this point in time.
And Tyler in the chat is echoing a little bit of what Michelle just brought up too, in terms of, and what you touched upon as well, Renee and Shannon, that if there's a need for additional services, referring out to somebody who has all of that appropriate credentialing seems to make more sense than requiring additional credentialing of the DSP. So for initial onboarding, same type of what I'm kind of summarizing, at least in my notes for next steps for us, is the addition, GED, 18 plus, those things that Shannon reflected that we saw in 506 and 1001 still make sense. In terms of the training, there could be something along the lines of maybe, I'm making things up now, but crisis de-escalation, some competencies that seem to make sense and appropriate for someone who might be asked to provide a little bit of extra service support, and additional staff helping to someone to, set someone up for success in de-escalating and really preserving. I think when we look at stabilization services, one of the goals is to preserve that current living situation. So making sure that there's some skills in that area, competencies in that area. But otherwise, really, if there was something that required specific expertise, such as mental health services, maybe being aware, some basic training there, things to watch for to best support someone and to figure out when that referral might be necessary or when to engage someone, but maybe not training in the actual provision of mental health services and supports. Just checking the chat box. I don't see anything. Krista.
So just to throw this out there, I think that the people that are on this panel represent area agencies and providers that are doing things right, like in the best way in some of these areas, especially it sounds like in the terms of providing services for people with behavioral or mental health needs. And so, talking about trainings that you're providing for your DSPs and supports. And I think, in the region that I'm in, these things are not happening. And so the assumption perhaps that, these things are just going to happen or that they are happening is like it's concerning to me in thinking about the needs that people have that have gone unmet and that they'll continue to go unmet if language isn't in here as a proactive way. And so I think some of the things that I'm saying I think maybe aren't making sense to the people on this panel, because it's a need that you're meeting in your regions and in your provider agencies that really where I'm living just are not being met at all. So I guess I just want to share that. It sounds like maybe you're doing it the right way and you're really training your staff and in the places where your individuals are receiving services really have procedures and trainings in place, and we don't. And individuals that I know and families that I know that are really needing these services and supports just are not getting them. So I guess I just want to share that and share that that's kind of where I'm coming from when I keep raising these questions. So
Chris, I think this is a really important perspective that so there's a couple of things rolled into what you're saying too. And first and foremost is that everyone's unique perspectives that they bring to this group are important so that we as a group can do what's really often challenging in figuring out what makes sense for the service system as a whole. And that balances, to your point, what do individuals and families need? What do provider agencies need in order to be able to provide the services? And what other criteria is out there that we all need to adhere to in realizing those things or incorporating them into our waiver and our rules? What are our guardrails as a state and as a community around what we can and can't do? So absolutely. And when we're having the conversation around us setting the expectation. So when we create the rule, when we create the waiver services and the provider qualifications, that's our expectation. And then figuring out as a service system, what do we do when someone's experience doesn't necessarily align with that expectation? But then also, as we're talking about best practices too, I think to your point, I think in the back of our minds, and maybe over the next few weeks too, when we come, if as folks are participating in your day-to-day activities, depending on how you interact with our service delivery system, are there any best practices that really should move from best practice to requirement to make sure that it's consistent and applied across the board for everybody providing or participating in a service? I think that's a really important thing for us to bring back, think about, and then reconnect maybe at our next meeting to see if there were any recommendations for something that could move from one column to the other. Oh, Shannon.
Yeah, I just wanted to speak to what Krista shared because I believe that to be true, that we're not all at the same place. There's definitely a bell-shaped curve. I think it's in HEM 506, but there's a particular section that maybe we need to draw it out differently, but it's very specific about the individual. So that's already in the rule. Maybe there's something that we need to make part of the rule. Just bear with me here as I kind of talk out loud, but to document that kind of individual specific training has happened, because it goes through everything from their service agreement to their care needs, and out of each of these you look at what kind of training needs to happen for this person. So maybe there's a way that it needs to be documented so that we know that that's happening for every individual who's receiving services.
So maybe somewhere in here, and I'm sorry folks, just to throw rule text up on the screen at you, but I think, Shannon, what you might have been referencing is here in 506, where it says, hey, someone who's working directly with an individual need to be trained in these areas.
Correct.
But what it doesn't necessarily prescribe is where that documentation rests. So right now in file reviews, various things, if somebody works through a system like Relias, that will track training, but not necessarily on someone's specific personal profile, their goals, the things that are unique to that individual and not across the board. How do we demonstrate that? And different entities have forms or maybe sign off. There's multiple ways that somebody can say, hey, here's proof that we've met it. And maybe what our group is thinking is in the effort of consistent application, maybe what might happen is, hey, this criteria all makes sense as written, but what we want to make consistent is how that's being documented and demonstrated. Is that?
Yeah, I think that is what I'm hoping would close the loop for somebody that's experiencing what Krista is experiencing in her region.
Okay. All right, I'm writing it down, guys. Just check for hands quick. Okay.
Krista, did that make sense to you, what I was saying?
Yes, thank you very much. I appreciate this group really, and Shannon, you especially taking the time to really think about that and to address that. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
All right, so Lindsay and I, we've got some good ideas brewing here in terms of how to represent or approach. And I think really hearing what you guys are saying too about, hey, the requirements we have right now do make sense, what we want to speak to. And I'm thinking not just the onboarding, but even as we start to approach the conversation around training, considering what the work group has recommended to us, or the subcommittee on workforce has recommended, and what we have, but how we know it was all done. How do we make sure that it was consistently applied? That's what we can try to focus on as we're bringing something that's maybe perhaps new in our system and evolving it to what folks need across the system, and making sure that we have that flexibility that our system also needs from a provider standpoint, being able to make sure that there are appropriate staff. There's appropriate staff available, I should say, who are appropriately credentialed to provide those services. All right. Oh, that was the last slide. Okay. All right. Well, this was a really good conversation. I think it gives us a good foundation for us to start writing some information out, but also as we start evaluating the other services too, when we get into the day, SEP, adult medical day, you know, a new service that we're adding in, and how we look to current sources in New Hampshire, and how certain trainings and requirements are documented. So we'll take that back. Thank you all for joining. We're right at the 12 o'clock hour. So if anybody has anything else, I'm happy to stay on, but if not, thank you as always for hopping on, and we will see everybody next month. Take care, everyone.
I'm staying on with you, Jess.
You're staying on with me. Yeah,
I'm staying on with you. I won't take more than a couple minutes.
it's okay. Let me just